Today's lesson is going to focus on how light operates on concave forms. And specifically, we're going to look at how concave forms often cast shadows onto themselves, as well as how reflected light works on them. Now we're going to introduce two other concepts today as well. The first is reflective objects. We're going to be working with a subject that has a highly reflective surface, and this gives us the opportunity to introduce a new shadow condition, what is called a reflected shadow. Now, one of the things I'm sure you're noticing is that as this course progresses, we're slowly increasing the complexity of the subjects we're working with. When you're learning to draw and shade, you want to find a sweet spot of complexity. You want each drawing you do to be slightly more challenging than the last, but you don't want to go too far. Attempting to draw a subject that is far more complex than you're ready for is a sure way to develop bad habits. But by gently challenging yourself each time you do a new drawing and slowly increasing the level of complexity of your subjects, will prepare you to tackle much more complex forms in the future, including figure drawing and even portraiture. Well, let's get started by taking a look at our first concave object, a simple bowl. Whenever you're drawing and shading more complex form, it's incredibly useful to be able to understand that form in relationship to more basic volumes. To understand the form of this bowl, let's first imagine it as a simple ovoid. Now, let's cut that ovoid in half. And finally, let's scoop out its center, leaving just a shell of the original ovoid, the thickness of which is visible at the rim of the bowl. This gets us remarkably close to the three-dimensional form of the bowl. Let's look at the light and shadow conditions on the outside surface of the bowl. This should be the easiest to understand. Whenever you're shading more complex form, I would highly encourage you to start with the broader, more basic light and shadow patterns, before chasing around smaller and more subtle details. So first, let's find the line of termination on the outside surface of the bowl. Let's focus on the shadow side of the line of termination. We know that there are two broad categories of shadow that we're looking for. The first is the core shadow. The core shadow follows the exact pattern we would expect to find on the bottom of an ovoid. And of course, immediately to the left of the core shadow, we can find the reflected light. Remember, reflected light is still considered a shadow condition because this area of the bowl is not receiving direct light. Remember, any part of your subject that is not being hit with direct light is considered to be in shadow. You've probably noticed that this bowl has a much more reflective surface than any of the volumes we've drawn from thus far. This is a great opportunity to introduce another shadow condition. So you should already be familiar with reflected light, as it is one of the fundamental shadow conditions. But take a look to the immediate left of the reflected light, right at the edge of the left side of the bowl. Hopefully you can see that the far left edge of the surface of the bowl gets much darker, almost as dark as the cast shadow. This is because this dark area is literally a reflection of the cast shadow. We refer to this dark area as reflected shadow. This bowl has almost a mirror-like finish, the surface of which will reflect its surroundings. You'll also see the effects of this mirror-like surface of the object when we talk about highlights in just a little bit. Before we move on, let your eyes go softly out of focus or squint them to make sure you can see the three distinct shadow patterns of the core shadow, reflected light, and the reflected shadow. Let's take a look again at the core shadow. It's important to remember that this bowl is essentially a hybrid volume made up of both spherical and cylindrical elements. This, of course, will dramatically impact how light operates on the bowl. In the upper left section of the core shadow, we can identify a distinct darker band. This darker band is another core shadow. To understand why this is happening, we have to understand how the volume is constructed. Take a look at the rim of the bowl. If we were to move our finger up and over the rim, it would create an arc, because the rim is rounded. This tells us that the rim of the bowl is essentially one long cylinder cut in half lengthwise, curving around the edge. I've enlarged the shape here for clarity, but hopefully you can see how well this describes the simple volume that makes up the rim of the bowl. So this darker area is a core shadow of the cylinder of the rim of the bowl. In fact, we can find two such core shadows. In addition to the core shadow we've just been looking at, if you follow the rim around to the right, you'll find another core shadow. Both are occurring because of the cylindrical nature of the rim of the bowl. This bowl has three distinct core shadows, each related to the foundational volumes that the bowl is constructed from. The rest of the shadow conditions we see are cast shadows. So we know that a cast shadow is created when an object blocks the light from hitting an adjacent surface. But frequently, a concave form will cast a shadow onto itself. Properly rendering this is one of the key ways to give the illusion of a concave form in your drawings. Like all other shadows, the area where the rim of the bowl casts a shadow onto the bottom of the bowl has a specific shape. You'll notice that this cast shadow is not as dark as the shadow cast by the entire bowl onto the surface the bowl is sitting on. There are two reasons for this. The first is that the bowl itself is a lighter value than the surface the bowl is sitting on. The lighter the value of the object, the lighter the values will be. The darker the object, the darker the values will appear. The second reason that this smaller cast shadow on the right is not as dark as the cast shadow on the left is because of reflected light. To understand how this works, take a look at the inside of the bowl. You can see that the left side of the interior of the bowl is generally brighter than the right side. Light comes down from the light source, strikes the left side of the interior of the bowl, and reflects downward, further illuminating the bottom of the bowl, which is already, of course, indirect light. This reflected light subtly lightens the value of the shadow cast by the rim of the bowl. But the reflected light doesn't stop there. It reflects off the bottom of the bowl and lightens the part of the cast shadow that runs up the right side of the interior of the bowl. Now let's shift gears and take a look at the lit areas of the bowl. At this point, you should be fairly comfortable with recognizing the transitions from the center lights to the midtones. But because the object is so highly reflective, we can see numerous highlights. This brings up an important question for the artist. How much information do you really need to include in your drawings? The answer to this question changes depending on the aims of the artist, the medium the artist is using, the style the artist is working in, and many other potential factors. But remember, the world is infinitely complex. We as artists cannot hope to ever capture all of the information contained in even the simplest of subjects. We must choose the level of detail wisely. In the demonstration drawing you'll see me do in just a few minutes, you'll see me select a few of the larger highlights, but leave out the smaller and less prominent highlights from the drawing. Understanding how light and shadow operate on volumes, particularly more complex volumes, is a critical step in understanding how to shade them. Before we move on, there's one final thing I'd like to show you. As I lower the light source, watch how both cast shadows elongate to the left. Regardless of the complexity of the subject, whenever you're drawing, you'll want to carefully craft both the size and shape of all shadow conditions. This ensures that the relationships between them will make sense, and the resulting drawing will be believable to the viewer. Now let's put these concepts into practice with a demonstration. Before any shading occurs, you can see that once again I've drawn in the basic shape of the object, as well as the lines of termination on the right and left sides of the bowl, and finally I've also drawn in the shape of the cast shadow. As you should already be familiar with, I'll begin the shading process by laying in a light wash of value in the form shadows. You can see that I've laid a darker wash of value in the area where the rim of the bowl is casting a shadow onto the right side of the bottom of the bowl. Next, I'll darken the cast shadow on the surface the bowl is sitting on. With confidence that my basic shapes and values are correctly drawn, and that my basic values are starting to read, I can begin darkening my values, starting with the cast shadow. the darkest value. Next, you'll see me darken the core shadow, and then I'll darken the reflected shadow, which is almost but not quite as dark as the occlusion shadow. It's important that you remember that during the shading process, your drawing will go through multiple iterations. You shouldn't feel that you need to finish or refine any section on the first pass. After making my first attempt at the mid-tone on the outside of the bowl, I'll shift my attention to the shadows on the right side of the interior of the bowl. Once I've made my first attempt at shading all of the basic shadow shapes, you'll see me begin to add subtlety and details, seeking out all of the small changes and details that the larger basic shadow shapes haven't captured. One of the most common shading errors I see beginning students make is that they lose a clear separation between the foundational values when beginning to add subtlety and details. In this demonstration drawing, you'll notice that no matter how many tiny details and small changes in the values that I draw, I'm maintaining a clear separation between the center lights, the midtones, the core shadows, the reflected light, and the cast shadows. Before I go too much farther in the drawing of the bowl itself, you'll see me darkening the surface that the bowl is sitting on. You've probably noticed that I haven't yet addressed the highlights. Near the end of the drawing, in addition to lifting out the highlights using an eraser, I've added a small amount of white acrylic paint in the highlight areas. The white paint I've used is even brighter than the paper itself. This is a great way to keep your highlights clean and sharp. You may also have noticed that I've left out a number of the smaller highlights from the original reference photo. Remember, it's always up to you as an artist to decide how much detail you want in any drawing or painting.